He was the unparalleled master of wit, the great American humorist who filled the world with laughter and wisdom. But the devastating, untold story is that behind Mark Twain's famous white suit and public cynicism lay a private life consumed by overwhelming, repeated tragedy, where his genius could not save his family from sickness and death. So what truly became of the 4 children born to the literary icon? And how did their short, complex lives break the heart of the man who wrote of Huckleberry Finn? Welcome. You clicked on this video because you know the voice of American letters, but you sense the real, human tragedy lies hidden within the pages of his personal life. In this exhaustive, deeply researched documentary, we will tell the complete, multi-layered story of Mark Twain's 4 children with his beloved wife, Olivia "Livy" Langdon Clemens. We will begin with the brief, heartbreaking life of his firstborn son, Langdon. We will explore the journey of the brilliant, tragic daughter, Susy, whose early death marked the turning point of his life. We will delve into the ambitious and tumultuous career of Clara, the only survivor. And we will uncover the difficult, heartbreaking story of his youngest daughter, Jean, whose life was cut short by illness. To bring you this powerful story, we have gone far beyond the familiar adventures on the Mississippi. We have meticulously researched the Mark Twain papers and project archives, analyzed the family's intimate letters detailing their intense grief, investigated the Gilded Age financial scandals, and pieced together the psychological narrative of an epic family sorrow. This is not just a superficial "where are they now?" It is a deep, unflinching exploration of the cost of genius, the fragility of Victorian life, and the 4 individuals who inherited a legacy of wit, wealth, and devastating loss. Number 4. The first loss, the shadow of disease, Langdon Clemens. The Mark Twain family saga begins here, with the firstborn son, whose life was agonizingly brief, becoming the first wound inflicted upon the famous humorist. His short life instilled in him a lifelong, pervasive fear of disease and death. Born on November 7, 1870, Langdon Clemens was the first child of Samuel Mark Twain Clemens and his wife, Olivia "Livy" Langdon Clemens. His birth came during the early, prosperous, and happy years of Twain's marriage. Twain was solidifying his reputation as a writer and beginning to amass a fortune from his early books and lectures. Langdon was born into an environment of intellectual excitement, artistic endeavor, and immense family love. He was the first son, the cherished heir. The family had just moved into their magnificent, newly constructed Victorian mansion in Hartford, Connecticut, a place that symbolized their rise to fortune and intellectual prominence. However, the late 19th century was a brutal time for childhood health. Diseases that are now easily treatable were rampant. In 1872, when Langdon was just 19 months old, tragedy struck. The infant contracted diphtheria, a highly contagious and often fatal bacterial disease that severely affects the respiratory system. In the 1870s, there was no effective treatment for diphtheria. No antitoxins or antibiotics existed. Families could only provide palliative care and watch helplessly. Langdon's illness was rapid and devastating. Despite the family's wealth and access to the best medical care available in Hartford, the disease ran its course. Langdon Clemens died on June 2, 1872, at the age of 1 year and 7 months. The impact of this loss on both Twain and Livy was profound. Livy, who was a fiercely devoted mother, was heartbroken, experiencing a grief that would permanently affect her health and emotional stability. For Mark Twain, the pain was existential. The loss of Langdon was the first chasm opened between his public persona as the funny, wise cynic and his private reality as a vulnerable, grieving father. Twain wrote agonizingly about the event, particularly a moment when he inadvertently left a window open, potentially exposing the sick child to a draft. A moment of self-blame that was disproportionate but indicative of his immense, impotent grief. The death of Langdon instilled in Twain a lifelong, pervasive fear of disease and death, a psychological scar that permeated his later, darker writings, including The Mysterious Stranger and his final, most pessimistic essays. he began a morbid obsession with the fragility of life and the cruelty of fate. The scandal of Langdon's life was the tragedy itself, a stark reminder that genius and wealth offered no immunity from the common sorrows of the era. The untold story is the enduring psychological wound his death created, serving as the beginning of the darkness that would ultimately consume the great humorist's soul. Langdon's short life was the hidden source of the deep, pervasive melancholy in the man who made the world laugh. Langdon's death was the first wound, but the next child, Susy, would grow up brilliant and ambitious, only to suffer an equally heartbreaking and more public tragedy. Number 3. The brilliant daughter, the broken promise. Olivia Susan Susy Clemens, the second child, Susy, was the bright star, the literary daughter who inherited her father's wit and intellectual intensity. She was the family's greatest hope, the one poised for greatness. Her death shattered the family and plunged Twain into final, profound pessimism. Born on March 19, 1872, Olivia Susan Susy Clemens arrived into a world of growing prosperity and international fame. She was named after her mother, Olivia, and, along with her sister Clara, grew up in the vibrant intellectual atmosphere of the family's Hartford home, often hosting luminaries like Harriet Beecher Stowe and William Dean Howells. Susy was, by all accounts, exceptionally gifted, fiery, articulate, and fiercely intelligent, possessing a wit that matched her father's. She was Mark Twain's favorite intellectual companion. She studied music and languages. Her greatest distinction came when, at the age of 13, she wrote a warm, candid, and often humorous biography of her father as a school project. Twain, immensely touched and amused by her observations, later incorporated parts of this manuscript directly into his own autobiography. Susy was the only person Twain truly trusted with his public and private narratives. The family's financial stability crumbled in the early 1890s due to Mark Twain's disastrous investment in the Page compositor typesetting machine, a technological failure that plunged the family into severe debt. To repay his creditors and recover their fortune, Twain embarked on a grueling, multi-year, round-the-world lecture tour in 1895. Susy, along with Livy and Clara, initially traveled with him. However, Susy, increasingly unhappy with the constant touring and perhaps suffering from nervousness and exhaustion, decided to return to the empty Hartford home to await the family's return. It was in 1896, with the rest of the family still abroad, Livy, Clara, and Jean with Twain, that tragedy struck again, swiftly and unexpectedly. Susy, at age 24, contracted spinal meningitis. Meningitis in the 1890s, especially the bacterial form, was a devastating disease with an extremely high mortality rate. There were no effective antibiotics. Susy's illness was rapid, agonizing, and ultimately fatal. She died in the Hartford home, alone except for a family friend, while her parents and siblings were thousands of miles away in England. The impact of Susy's death was the turning point in Mark Twain's life, the hinge upon which his emotional world broke. It was a tragedy compounded by the immense guilt that he and Livy felt for having left her alone. His best friend, William Dean Howells, famously observed that Twain died with Susy. His famous wit faded, replaced by an abiding deep cynicism and nihilism. His subsequent writings, such as The Mysterious Stranger, are marked by a profound darkness, a rejection of humanity, and a belief in the cruelty of fate. Susy Clemens's scandal was the tragedy of her premature death, a consequence of the financial ruin that forced her family abroad. The untold story is the depth of her literary talent and her psychological importance to her father. She was the one child who truly connected with his genius, and her loss extinguished the last remnants of his essential optimism. Susy's death was the hinge upon which the family's fate turned. The surviving daughters were left to navigate a world consumed by this grief, particularly the next daughter, Clara, whose life became a continuous, tumultuous battle for stability and her father's affection. Number 2. The ambitious survivor, The opera star, Clara Langdon Clemens, the last survivor. She escaped childhood illness, but lived a life burdened by immense grief, ambition, and a complex, often fraught relationship with her famous cold father. She sought validation on the world's most demanding stages. Born on June 8, 1874, Clara Langdon Clemens was the third child. Her entire upbringing was marked by the intensity of her father's ambition and the emotional fragility of her mother. She grew up in the shadow of Susy's brilliance and later, Susy's tragic death. Her life was defined by external chaos. The financial ruin from the Page compositor scandal, which wiped out the family fortune, the necessary, years-long exile in Europe to avoid creditors, and the immense grief over Susy's death, which made her father retreat into a cold, critical shell. Clara was left to navigate a household dominated by her mother's illness and her father's deep, pervasive sadness. Clara possessed an ambition equal to her father's, but she channeled it into music. She pursued a demanding career as an opera singer, a choice that forced her onto the world's most judgmental stages. She traveled the world for her studies and performances, working tirelessly to achieve professional validation. Her career was met with mixed critical success. While some praised her power and dramatic ability, she faced criticism common to any performer in the shadow of a literary giant. This pressure contributed to periods of severe physical illness and nervous breakdowns, which forced her to temporarily abandon her career multiple times. She found stability in her first marriage. In 1909, she married the renowned Russian concert pianist and conductor, Osip Gavrilovich. This was a deep, loving, and supportive partnership. They had one daughter, Nina, in 1910, who became the sole surviving grandchild of Mark Twain. However, this period of happiness was tragically short-lived. Osip died prematurely in 1936. Clara's subsequent years were marked by accumulated, crushing tragedy. She was the one who had to care for her aging, declining father, witnessing his descent into misanthropy and despair before his death in 1910. After her husband Osip's death, she was left alone. Her only daughter, Nina, descended into alcoholism and battled mental illness, dying tragically in 1966. Clara had to endure the ultimate pain of burying her only child, a direct echo of the sorrow that had defined her father. She remarried in 1944 to Jacques Samosud, but remained the primary keeper and editor of her father's sprawling legacy and papers. She wrote the biography, My Father, Mark Twain, a more protective and affectionate portrait than her brother's more controversial memoirs. Her primary scandal was the public nature of her nervous breakdowns and the lawsuit she pursued against a publisher who threatened to expose the contents of a memoir written by Twain's secretary, Isabel Lyon, that contained unflattering details about the family. She fought fiercely to control the narrative. The untold story of Clara Clemens is her relentless perseverance. She was the last survivor, a woman who endured the loss of a mother, two siblings, Susy and Langdon, a father, a husband, and her only child. Her life was a tragic testament to the destructive power of grief and the difficulty of escaping the emotional wounds inflicted by a demanding, cold father. Yet, she lived the longest, carrying the entire weight of the Clemens legacy until her death in 1962. Clara carried the burden of the surviving legacy, enduring tragedy after tragedy. But the final, youngest daughter, Jean, would be lost to a different, less understood illness, completing the cycle of grief that defined Twain's final years. Number 1. The youngest child, the final blow. Jean Clemens, the final child. Born during the family's financial crisis, she was the youngest, the sweet, devoted daughter. But her life was tragically marked by an illness that placed her outside the rigid social norms of the time and led to one last, devastating loss for the aging father. Born on July 26, 1880, Jean Clemens was the fourth and final child of Mark Twain and Livy. Her entire childhood unfolded amidst the family's financial ruin. The catastrophic losses from the Page compositor machine, and the emotional upheaval of the lecture tours and the necessary move to Europe to save the family fortune. She was just 16 when her beloved sister Susy died. The central defining tragedy of John's life was her severe, debilitating epilepsy, which emerged in her early teens. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, epilepsy was a poorly understood, highly stigmatized condition. Jean's increasingly frequent and severe seizures placed her outside the rigid social circle her family occupied. She was unable to attend school consistently or lead a normal social life, often confined to the family home or placed under the care of nurses. This illness created a complex dynamic between Jean and her parents. Twain, always obsessed with control and order, struggled immensely with the unpredictability of Jean's illness. There were periods of immense frustration and anger, leading to a profound rift where he briefly separated himself from her care. However, after Livy's death in 1904, which devastated Twain, the relationship between John and her father softened dramatically. In the final years of his life, John became her father's dedicated secretary and constant companion. She moved back into his home at Stormfield, Connecticut. She was the one who managed his daily affairs, organized his papers, and provided the direct, loving care he desperately needed as he aged and grew more bitter. This shared intimacy was a powerful redemption for both. Jean finally had the exclusive, consistent attention of her father, and Twain finally had the unconditional, practical love he needed. Tragically, this final period of peace was short-lived. On December 24, 1909, Christmas Eve, Jean Clemens suffered a fatal epileptic seizure in the bathtub of the family's home in Redding, Connecticut. She was only 29 years old. Her death was the final blow to Mark Twain. It occurred less than 6 months after the passing of his best friend, Henry Rogers. Twain, who had lost his wife and 2 other children, was utterly broken. He called Jane's death the Great Calamity, and wrote a poignant, famous final entry in his diary about the silence of the house after her body was taken away. He died 4 months later, in April 1910. Her death was the last sorrow he could bear. The scandal of Jean Clemens was the social stigma surrounding her illness. The untold story is the immense sadness of her life, marked by exclusion due to her illness and the tragic circumstances of her death. The final emotional wound that closed the book on the life of Mark Twain. Her life was one of profound devotion, culminating in the final quiet act of service to her father. The 4 lives of the Clemens children, Langdon, Susy, Clara, and Jean, tell a tragic and profound saga of genius, humor, and overwhelming loss. Their collective story is the hidden source of the deep, pervasive melancholy in the man who made the world laugh. This theme of a great American figure whose life was defined by national conflict and whose children had to navigate the subsequent political, historical shadow resonates powerfully across American history. That general was the iconic leader of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee. On this channel previously, we explored the fascinating and often poignant story of Robert E. Lee's 7 children. Did you know that the heirs of the Confederacy's most revered general faced their own unique struggles in the harsh aftermath of the Civil War? Their lives involved military service, following their father, artistic pursuits, and managing the family estate at Arlington before its loss, and navigating the complex legacy of defeat and Southern identity. The full, untold story of the Lee children offers a compelling counterpoint to the Clemens dynasty. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover that incredible, untold story. And as always, thank you for watching.